Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist teaching at the University of Colorado, previously at Berkeley and UCLA. Today I want to talk about how the Old Norse language was written in runes during the Viking Age. There is a widespread misconception that the alphabet called the Elder Futhark was the runic alphabet used to write Old Norse. But in fact, the Elder Futhark is many centuries older than the language we call Old Norse, many centuries older than the Viking Age. The Younger Futhark alphabet developed from the Elder Futhark alphabet, but whereas the Elder Futhark alphabet had 24 letters arranged in 3 groups or families of 8, the Younger Futhark has only 16 letters arranged in 3 groups of 6, 5, and 5 respectively. This reduction in the number of letters does not reflect a change in the language away from having more sounds. In fact, there are more vowel sounds in the Old Norse language than there are in the Proto-Germanic or Proto-Norse language written with the Elder Futhark. But there are fewer letters to write them. It's difficult to understand what might have motivated this change, although perhaps the Younger Futhark was easier to learn how to write, though it is in fact much harder to learn how to read, because the letters can mean so many different things. So let's look at, first of all, what these different letters can represent, and then using some images that I find around the web, I will take a look at some actual inscriptions with you in Younger Futhark, and we'll take a look at the differences between sort of our ideals about how one might write runes and the way that people actually did 1200, 1300, 1100 years ago. All right, well, as I said, there are actually quite a number of vowels in the Old Norse language. There are 9 distinct vowel qualities, and by the Viking Age and into the 1100s or so, there were a distinct class of nasal long vowels as well as a distinct class of oral long vowels. So in a sense, you have 27 vowels, although really it's 9 vowel qualities with 3 in 3 different sets. You have a short set of those 9, a long set of those 9, and then a long nasal set of those 9. But there are only 4 letters in Younger Futhark for writing vowel sounds. So to begin with, there is ur. This is the vowel that is typically represented when we transliterate runic writing as u. But it stands for much more than u. It stands for any rounded vowel. So it stands for u, for o, for the I umlaut of O, so this is written as O slash. Sometimes the long version is written as an O-E together. It stands for the letter written as Y, a high front rounded vowel, E, like German U with 2 dots. So any rounded vowel, with one exception that we'll see later, is written with this letter ur. So for instance, the actual word ur, meaning slag from iron, is written with this vowel, but so is the first vowel in the word dóttir, meaning daughter, which is attested in many runic inscriptions. The name of the god Thor is also written with this vowel, because O, being a round vowel, is written with the rune ur. Then there is the rune is. This is transliterated as an I, but it stands for not just I, but also for E. So anytime you have a word like fisk, fisker, fish, that's going to have this sound. Of course, the word is itself, meaning ice, will be written with this vowel. But then many words written with E in Roman writing are going to be written with an is in runic writing as well. So for instance, verbs such as vesa, to be, bera, to carry or bear, vera, to become, will be written with is. But not all letter E in Old Norse will be written with is. Sometimes they will be written with the vowels, with the vowel letters that are used for the letter A, because many of the E's, the sound E in Old Norse, are produced by umlaut from A. Because these E's apparently had a somewhat different sound in the Viking Age, they are still written distinctly from the E's that actually come from an original E. So in a verb like vesa, bera, verda, that E goes back to Proto-Germanic, and other Germanic languages are going to have cognates of that E there. So for instance, vesa to be, you see Old English wesan, you see Gothic wisan, bera, you see Gothic baron, Old English baron, etc. But some E's, the sound E in Old Norse, are from umlaut. So for instance, in madr, man, the plural is man. That E isn't original, the E is created by umlaut. Now I have another video that explains how umlaut phenomena work. I'll link that and a card in the top right. If you're familiar with umlaut, keep in mind that an E produced by umlaut is not going to be written with the rune is. Now with those two vowel letters, and is, you can write most of the vowels off the Old Norse language. But there are still two remaining vowel letters, and they are both used for the letter A, the sound A, or for vowels derived from that sound by umlaut phenomena. Again, if you haven't previously become familiar with umlaut in Old Norse, check out my video about that subject. Now, why would you have two letters for writing one sound when we have five sounds written with just two letters? Well, keep in mind that alphabets, although they may be designed initially as very efficient systems, as the Elder Futhark was, as they go on and develop in time and the language changes, something originally designed to be efficient may lose some of that efficiency simply by the traditions of how it's used. So if you look at the Elder Futhark, almost every letter has a name that begins with the sound that it writes. The exceptions are Ingvar's and what's the one called that has the Z at the end? At any rate, the ng rune and the z rune don't have names that begin with the sound of that rune because those sounds are never at the beginning of a word. But each rune in the Elder Futhark represented the sound that its name began with. All right, so the A rune was Ansus in Elder Futhark. As you get into Old Norse, that N disappears, but it nasalizes the preceding A, and we get something that in Viking Age Old Norse probably sounded like os, with a nasal a long nasal as. I have a difficult time making those nasal vowels. Well, once that had become a nasal it began to represent that long nasal sound. And in the meantime, the Elder Futhark rune Yara, which had stood for the y sound, lost that word lost the y sound and became in Viking Age Old Norse ar. So now that rune comes to represent the regular a sound, but the original a rune os comes to represent the nasalized a sound. So what you've got is if you have an a or vowel derived from it. So e sometimes will be derived from a by I umlaut. Ash is always derived from a by I umlaut. And then hook o or o caudata is derived from a by u umlaut. All these vowels are written with the rune or in Viking Age Younger Futhark. But if they are nasal and long, they are written with the rune os, the original a rune. So for instance, the word or, which means year, that is written with the rune or, whereas os, which means God, this is the singular of Asir, which means gods, the family of gods which Odin, Thor, and Frigg belong. That is written with the rune os. So similarly, the preposition on, which means on, that is written with os because it's a nasalized vowel. Consider that in English you can still see that in because it's cognate with the English word on. Whereas in a word like just berra, that verb, or vesa, that verb, that a is written with the typical a rune or. Even though there was an n behind that a once, it is a short vowel, and so it is not written with os. Typically, os is only used for long and nasal, but consider it is used for long and nasal vowels other than a if those vowels are derived from a by umlaut. So asnir, the plural of os, is still written with the os rune because in Futhark we don't distinguish between the original vowel sound and the sound derived from it by umlaut. All right, let's look at the consonants. The F rune, fe, is used to write F. There's nothing too terribly complicated about that, but remember that in Old Norse, if it's not at the beginning of a word or doubled, F typically stands for the sound of V. The TH rune, thorn, or in Younger Futhark, this is really called Thors, but we call the same letter thorn in the Roman alphabet when it's used in Old Norse or Icelandic. This is used for both thorn and ed. So the word thorn would be written with Thors, but so would mother, man. There's no distinction between thorn and ed in Younger Futhark writing. They're both written with the rune Thors. Then we have the interesting question about the R runes. There are two runes that stand for R. There's Reið, which looks like a Roman alphabet R, and then there's Yr, which is at the very end. And typically when you transliterate these runes, Reið is transliterated as a normal R, but Yr is transliterated as a capital R. That's to keep them distinct when we transliterate. So for instance, just the names of the runes, Reið would be written this way in Younger Futhark and transliterated this way in the Roman alphabet, and the name of the rune Yr would be written this way in Younger Futhark and transliterated this way in the Roman alphabet. In scholarly writing about runes. Why are there two runes for R? Well, it's similar to the reason why there's two runes for A. It's historical developments in the language. Yr comes from a rune that in the Elder Futhark stands for the sound Z. That's in Proto-Germanic or Proto-Norse. But in Old Norse, that sound became an R. And so what we've got is we have the original R rune used to write R when it's actually an original Germanic R, but we have Yr to write R when that R actually comes from a Germanic Z. So typically in the root of a word, you're going to see Reið. So in a word like rot, root, that's Reið. In a word like thrir, meaning three, the first R part of the root is going to be Reið, but the R at the end is going to be Yr because that's an ending. In a word like from, frå, you're going to see Reið. And now consider that if you look at those English cognates, you're going to see R's there. You're going to see root, you're going to see three, you're going to see from. So one good guide that's not perfect, but that probably works 85% or so of the time, is that if there's an R there in English, then that Old Norse word, because remember English and Old Norse are very closely related, then the Old Norse cognate will be written with a Reið, at least if that R is in the same position as the R in the cognate English word. But then if you consider the fact that plural nouns in Old Norse typically end in R, think about hestar, horses, or sogur, stories, sagas. Consider that the English plurals there are S's, horses, sagas, stories, right? So in English, that S, which is actually pronounced as a Z, comes from the Germanic Z, whereas that R, it's developed into an R in Old Norse, so they are cognate. So if you see an ending, especially those plural endings like that, that's an Yr in Futhark and Old Norse. There are some other places where Yr is used, not just in plurals. They are used in the second and third person singular of verbs. So for instance, skuter, shoots, that would be Yr, because that is a grammatical ending. Consider English shoots, where there's an S. Or in, say, riðr, the first R, this is rides. So in English, you can also see that first R is an R, so that's Reið in Old Norse and Younger Futhark, but that last R is an S in English. Those are from Germanic Z, so that's going to be written with Yr. So you're going to get riðr, Reið, Ís, thors ur. All right. Another place you see it is in comparatives. So in words like more, Old Norse meiri, better, Old Norse betri. Even though that is an R in English, that is ultimately from a Z in Germanic. English had the same development as Old Norse in this case. So those comparative R's will be written with ur as well. The rune kaun is used for both K and for G, so both the voiceless and the voiced velar stop. G, of course, can be a velar fricative, often in Old Norse, but either way, the kaun rune is used for that. The H rune, hagal, that is used for H, pretty straightforward. Nauthr, the N rune, is used for N, pretty straightforward. S, sol, is used for S, pretty straightforward. Tyr, the T rune, is used for both T and for D. So the name of the rune would be written in runes as Tyr. This is, of course, the name of the one-handed god, but also a word with a D in it, like hundr. That D would be written as a Tyr. B, Bjarkan, that is both B and P, so just like K, K and G being represented by kaun, both the voiceless and the voiced bilabial stop B and P are written with one rune. And then M, Madr, writes M, pretty straightforward. L, Logr, writes L, pretty straightforward. So notice that you have this this system that is systematic, even if it's inefficient, where two stop consonants made in the same place, whether K and G, T or D, P or B, are written with the same rune. Runes just ignore the voicelessness versus voicedness, whereas they maintain whether an R is descended from an R 500 years before or a Z 500 years before this alphabet was being used. So again, alphabets don't always develop purely by efficiency. All right. Well, and what follows, what I'm going to do is leave behind this beautiful mountain backdrop for a little while and instead look at some actual inscriptions so that we can see these principles being applied. Now here is the first real runic inscription that I want to look at with you so that we can establish what these principles actually looked like in Viking Age writing in the Younger Futhark. Now runes are identified by a catalog number by the project Rundata that identifies first where the inscription is from and then simply has a catalog number. So every region of Sweden has a particular designation. In this case, this inscription is from Södermanland, and so the first two letters of Södermanland are used to designate the region, and then this is simply number 107. It's archived under 107 from that region. So first of all, let me talk about how I've presented this on the right. I have, first of all, the Younger Futhark written out with my Younger Futhark font, which is available to my Patreon supporters. Then below that, I have the transliterated Futhark, and then below that, I have something that approaches standardized Old Norse. At least this is the closest I can get in standardized Old Norse writing to duplicating what's in the transliteration. Sometimes this is going to be pretty different from standard textbook Old Norse because standard textbook Old Norse is Old Icelandic from the 1200s. Mostly what we're going to be looking at here is Swedish from the 900s, 1000s. The vast majority of inscriptions are from Sweden. In fact, in Rundata, every region of Sweden has its own catalog designation, like Södermanland, Uppland, Västergötland, etc. But then there's only one designation for all of Denmark, for example, just because so many of these inscriptions come from Sweden. Notice that the lines in my transliteration do not correspond to lines in the original, but I will talk about lines so you can see what word in particular I'm talking about. But the lines in the Younger Futhark writing and then the transliteration done by me on the right do line up so you can compare things more quickly. Okay, notice for the very first thing that in runic writing there isn't always a clear break between words. Sometimes there's just a space, but sometimes you also do have clear marks put between words to separate them. In this case, 2 dots, a pretty common way of doing this, are put between all the words, and the inscription also begins with 2 dots before the first word. It looks, of course, like a colon in Roman alphabet writing. So the very first word, which I've transliterated as Rulever, this name would be probably pronounced something like Rolever in archaic Swedish. This is then cognate with the name Hrolever or Hroðlever in Old West Norse, which is typically what you learn in an Old Norse class, Old Icelandic. Fame survivor, fame remnant, something like this. This is also the name that was misheard as Rollo by early Frankish writers or early French writers. The name contains 2 R's. That first R is written with Reið because it's part of the root of the name. But then that second R is written with Ur because that second R is an ending. In this particular case, the ending R designates that this is a masculine nominative noun. Then notice in the second word, reisti, that EI is always written as AI, or rather or is, in Younger Futhark. This probably reflects the fact that the E in that sequence would have been pronounced like the I umlauted E, which must have still sounded subtly different from the original E from Germanic. Probably this E produced by I umlaut sounded more like an ass sound. That would also be reflected in the fact that the long correspondent of this vowel is written ash. So in my more normalized writing at the bottom in italics, I have written E's that are represented by an A rune with a caudata. This is also done by some really particular editors of Old Norse texts. And you can see the same thing in word 3, Stein, written with AIN runes. Now, any particular error that you might make in writing Old Norse in runes is going to be reflected somewhere in some real inscription. In this case, notice that word for, a form of this, which was quite common in archaic Swedish, thensi, the vowel between the Thors rune and now the runes for thorn and in, respectively, is missing. It simply was left out by the inscriber. Notice in the last word that I've written in line 1, fóður, that we have in classical Old Norse at the bottom, the o caudata, hook o. Of course, that is a vowel produced by u umlaut from an A, so it is simply written as A in runes. Now, in the first word of the second line, as I've written it, you'll see the word sin. Now, in classical Old Norse transcription, that is written with, in classical Old Norse, as written in the Roman alphabet, that is written with 2 N's. But in runic writing, we almost never see 2 of the same letter in sequence. So this will be written with 1 neuther, 1 in rune, and we have to supply the second one in writing this out in classical Old Norse as it's written in the Roman alphabet. Now, in the third word in the second line, notice that there isn't a colon or mark to distinguish the 2 words han and vars. There's just space, although that could be due to damage in the inscription. It's a little bit hard to say. There may have been a mark there before. The word han, typically this word and related words like hon, she, honum, to him, will be written with the vowel or, but sometimes you will see os because these are from originally a long nasal vowel, but that's fairly archaic, so only in pretty old inscriptions. The word var, which comes next, this is also a later form of this word that you'll see in some inscriptions. In more archaic Old Norse, you'll see vas, but in Old East Norse first, and then about 200 years later in Old West Norse, you see that transition to var, which is written with ur originally, because the other forms of that verb that have r's have the origin in the z of Germanic and thus are written ur. In farin, again, we have the two letters in sequence reduced to just one. In runes, again, that is a double N reduced to one N or one náðar rune. And the R is Reið, because this is part of the root of this verb, which is cognate with English fare, like in farewell. In med, with, you can see that E is written with the rune is. And then in the name Ingvar, in the dative Ingvari, at the very end of this inscription, notice that N is almost never written before a G or K, which of course are both written with the same rune, kaun. All right, now let us look at another inscription from nearby and with a somewhat similar content. All right, this is Suramanland 131. Both of these two first stones that I've looked at are part of the Ingvar group of stones, which talk about expeditions with a man named Ingvar, who is also commemorated in a saga written in Old West Norse called Ingvar Saga Viðforla, Saga of Ingvar the Wide-Traveled. And of course, these stones about men who fell with Ingvar during his travels attest to those very travels mentioned in the saga. All right, so I won't go back over things that are redundant with what I mentioned in the last one, but notice that any given runestone is going to have sort of imperfections. You're never going to find the perfect runestone that exactly has every feature that I could ever name. You're going to have things that are going to have some archaic features and some new features, and then you're going to look at the next stone and it's going to have different archaic features but also different new features, and this one is no exception relative to the other one. So in that very first word, this is the name Spjóti. Notice again P and B both written with the B rune, Bjarkan. Then in the name Halfdan, we have again D and T are both written with the T rune, Tyr. In the word þeir, they, we see once again EI written as AI, and then the R is written with yr because that R at the end goes back to a grammatical ending rather than the root of the word. Then, if you notice in line 2, the last word in that line is for, went. This is written with the vowel ur because, of course, O is written with the same rune as U, and the R is written with reið because the R is part of the root of the word, again, cognate with English fair. In line 3, in the second and third words, you see the characteristic writing of E with I, if the E actually goes back to a Germanic origin, so Halfdan and Med, both written with the is rune, the I rune. Again, in the fourth word in line 3, Ingvari, this is the dative of that name, we see that N is not written before G or K. We also see the rune os used for the word on, Old Norse at least Viking Age Old Norse that was a nasal long A because the N had dropped out and nasalized the vowel. In the last word of line 3, Serklandi, this is a dative of Serkland, which was a Norse designation for the area we know as the Middle East today. Often in runic inscriptions, we see that N is not written before T or D, just as it is not written before G or K, but here it is written before T or D, so runic writing is very inconsistent about this. In line 4, the very first word, likr, notice again G and K both written with the K rune, kaun. In then the last two words, sonur, evindar, notice that those R's, and well, actually all three words in that last line, those R's are all written with ur because they're all grammatical endings. We have a third singular verb, likr, we have a masculine nominative singular noun, sonur, and we have a masculine genitive singular, Eyvindar. Well, that would be the Old West Norse form, but this is the Old East Norse form without a diphthong in that first vowel of that word. Now let's look at DR 295. DR is the code for Denmark. Again, there's one code for the entire country, as there are with all the other Scandinavian countries, because so many of the inscriptions come from Sweden. In this case, I have not written out the Younger Futhark in my font, but in just Unicode Younger Futhark long branch, because my pretty archaic long branch Younger Futhark font can't reflect one fact of this inscription that's pretty interesting to note a little bit later on. In general, all the inscriptions that I'm looking at in this video are long branch. I may end up doing just a different video talking about the differences with short branch, which is a little bit different looking, but the fundamentals of writing Younger Futhark are better taught with long branch, I think. All right, so let's take a look here. We've got Áskell sati, that second word in the first line. Notice that there are two T's in the normalized Old Norse word, but we're only going to write one in Futhark. And the third word, this would be Stein in an older inscription, but in Old East Norse, diphthongs start monophthongizing pretty early on, right around the year 1000. So this reflects a monophthongized pronunciation of that earlier word Stein, probably pronounced something like Sten, and so the being equivalent to the sound of the Germanic E, it's written with the I rune, is. Then we see, notice in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth word in line 1, this would be Eftir. In the inscription, that line is a little bit damaged, and so the two last letters don't show. When there is damage, we put brackets and then ellipses within the brackets to show where text is missing. But it's pretty easy to infer that the two letters that are missing there are is, ir, ir, because that same word appears a little bit later in the inscription. In the second line, look at word 3. This is interesting because this is the word ser, to oneself. It is unusual that this would be written with the A rune or, because this does come from a higher vowel in Germanic. Probably what's happened here is we're at a point in East Norse where the E's before R's are getting lowered regardless of their origin, something that you can hear in East Norse today, Swedish and Danish. So this doesn't reflect the origin of the vowel any longer, but just how it's being articulated in this particular dialect. By the way, speaking of East Norse, let me take a moment to note that this is from Skåne, which today is in Sweden, but it is counted as a Danish inscription because this was part of Denmark in the Middle Ages. All right, in the second line again, look at the sixth word, which is written the same way in runes, but is not the same, would not have been spoken the same. This is sor, this is that one, who. So the R is just an abbreviation. It is a, what's that word in English? It's a contraction of er, which means is or who. All right, now the reason why I used this Unicode series of runes is look at the third line, the first word, egi, not. This G is actually written distinctly from a K. It has a dot in it. Now in medieval runes, the descendant system of runes from Younger Futhark, this becomes standard. K will be written with the old Kaun rune, and G will become always written as Kaun with a dot. Similarly, I will be written as is, but E as is with a dot. No other G's in this inscription are written this way, but this suggests that this custom is beginning, and perhaps the person carving the stone had learned that new system somewhere and is only sort of haphazardly remembering how that works. Now this inscription uses two dots to separate words, but notice that where words are separated does not necessarily agree with where we think words should be separated. In the third line, what's written as the third and fourth word, Uppsala, is the name of the place, Uppsala, modern Swedish Uppsala. This is one word to us. It is one word as written in standardized Old Norse, but it is a compound word, and it has been written as two words here. Whereas there's not two dots, although there is a little bit of space between Salum and Satu. And by the way, in the at the bottom there in my normalized or semi-normalized Old Norse, in italics, I shouldn't have written that as Sotu, they sat. I should have written it as Satu with a short A and two T's, meaning they set. So the Drengjar, the men, the brave men, set after their brother a stone. All right. Then in line 4, notice word 2. We would actually expect a U or an Ur rune between the Thors rune and the Reið rune in brother. Perhaps this is a dialectical difference. Perhaps it's just been left out. But notice that the R in brother, or well, it would have actually been pronounced brother. That R is a Reið because it is part of the root of the word. Notice, again, one diagnostic tool you can use is whether that R is present in English or not, and it is. The word is brother in English with an R. Again, in line 4, the fourth word, we see that the word for on, Viking Age Old Norse is written with the nasal os rune because it was pronounced with nasalized sound. We then see other characteristics, Bjarki, which is really Bjargi, because G and K are written with the same rune, except in one word in this inscription. Stuðan is written with the Ur rune, transliterated as a U because it's a rounded vowel. In the last line, notice that Þeir is also monophthongized now. This is they. That is monophthongized to probably a sound E, which is written with the rune for I, is. And then notice the second to last word is Gengu, they went. The G's are going to be written as K's. The E is an I because it's from a Germanic E. But notice again that N is not written before a G or a K. All right, now let's look at another one from Södermanland. This is Södermanland 148. The very first word we see Thjóðolfur. This is written, of course, with ur at the end because that is the masculine nominative subject ending. Not a whole lot of other unusual things here. Notice that the second line, second word, fadur, as it's written in runes, that is fóður and normalized Old Norse writing. That would be that is written with Reið because, of course, notice that R is there in English. Father, it is part of the root of the word, just like in brother. In sin, we see again that double letters are written as one. In han vas, we see the more archaic form of the word var that we've seen in other inscriptions. And then we have an inscription that sort of falls apart toward the end. Antath probably stands for endaður, ended. The R is missing perhaps by damage to the inscription, perhaps by something that the writer just didn't think about. No doubt the carving of these inscriptions took a while and you could probably lose your train of thought. That would be written with or rather than with is because the E there is produced by I umlaut. The root in Gothic we see is and, which shows us that the original root has A, not E. Then it ends with E kath, and then a U and an M that are kind of oddly placed. I suppose I didn't write that in runes at the top. Oh well. But that probably stands for Garðum with the R missing. That no doubt stands for the area of modern Russia, which is often called Garðariki in Old Norse, the realm of the Garðar, the enclosures, which is of course related to the word grad, which you see in the names of many places in Russia, Leningrad, Stalingrad, etc. One thing to note before I leave this inscription is that caudata, that tail that we add at the end in writing standard Old Norse, so like in the word fóður and that last line, or in endaður, where I'm indicating that the E is created by umlaut. In writing Old Norse in the Roman alphabet, that doesn't stand for nasalization, it stands for umlaut, basically. But in transcribing Younger Futhark, when that's written under an A, it represents the vowel os, as we'll see in the next inscription. Now, like I said, every mistake, every aberration from the rules that you can imagine is present in some inscription somewhere. This is VG 59. VG stands for Västergötland, another region of Sweden. And so this inscription could kind of be called nasality gone wild. Typically, os, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, will only be seen in long nasal A and vowels derived from A by umlaut. But in this inscription, pretty much every vowel that's an A or a vowel derived from it that is anywhere in a nasal environment, so next to an N or an M, is going to have that nasal os rune. So unusual. Let's look at it, some various features. The very first word written as rifnikr in the inscription, that's probably something like refningur, which would be cognate with Old West Norse hrafningur. So the H before R drops off in Old East Norse as well as in Old Norwegian, remaining only in Icelandic. That would mean like the ravening. The E is possibly from I umlaut, from the ing behind it, though it is not written with the A rune here. Notice in the very second word, we've seen this before, ok is Old Norse and, but in Younger Futhark it is almost always written as auk, A-U-K. That is undoubtedly an earlier form of this word, which is cognate with German auch also. Whether this reflects Viking Age pronunciation or merely a custom is difficult to say. Now let's take a look at one of these unusual presences of the os rune and the second line, word 3, thansi. We've seen that written with or instead of os in other inscriptions, but here the fact that it's touching an N or an M has made it written os. Then we have down one line, the second word in line 3, Góðan, good. We have the A written as an os, which is again unusual because that's a short vowel, not a long vowel. In hevir, which is the fifth word in line 3, we can see that the E, which is definitely produced by I umlaut of A, is also written as an I, just like in Refninger, the first word, suggesting that perhaps in the dialect where that was spoken, where this inscription was inscribed, that the distinction between E produced by I umlaut and E produced that was simply from Germanic E had disappeared. In the name Ossa, the very next word in line 3, that would have, of course, at this time been nasal Ossa. This is the feminine form of the word os, meaning God. It is unusual in the very next word that in an inscription where we see that the distinction between umlaut E and original Germanic E has disappeared, that the word s, which is or who, is written with or, when we'd actually expect that to be written with is, because it is originally from Germanic E or I. But perhaps the very fact that the inscriber was confused about why some E's would be written with is and some would be written with or is, again, another suggestion that the two E sounds have fallen together in this dialect. Also, of course, in the word kfen in line 4, word 3. In the very last word of line 4, as I've rendered this, we see that's written in Younger Futhark as kaurwa. Sometimes, especially in sort of later Younger Futhark, you will see the vowel written o dada or hook o in standardized Old Norse written as au. Interestingly, this is also done in some very early writing in Old Norse in the Roman alphabet, so it's possibly a carryover from runic conventions. Then we see at the very ending the word runar. Curiously, the A is not written with os, even though that would be a nasalized environment by the standards of this inscription. It is next to an N. But the root R in the word rune is written Reið, and the final R, which is just a grammatical ending, making it plural, is written ur, just as we'd expect. So this inscription has some interesting archaic features. It has all of these vowels and nasal environments written with os, but then it has at least one really new feature, which is that the e's from I umlaut and the e's from an original Germanic e or I have been confused. All right, here is the last inscription that I'm going to look at with you folks here today. This is U135. U stands for Uppland, another region of Sweden. Here we see that instead of the colon-like two dots, the words are separated by a plus sign looking symbol, or occasionally by dots. There are also interesting cases where the words are not separated at all. The very first word we see is the name Ingifast. Here we see two interesting things. One is that, of course, again, N is not written before G or K, but notice at the very end, what we have is not ur, which we'd expect because that's the masculine nominative singular ending on a masculine name, but rather Reið. So around the year 1000, and notice that there is a cross on this stone, which also suggests a late date because of the Christian iconography, we start to see ur replaced by Reið for all occurrences of R. Eventually you see ur reappear as a rune for the vowel Y and the transition of medieval runes, which eventually will have one rune equivalent to every letter of the Roman alphabet used to write Old Norse. Still some archaic features here. We still see ok written as auk. In the third word in line 1, we see the name Eystein written as Eystein. This is interesting because even though this is getting a little bit later, we still have diphthongs in this dialect of Swedish, so it's not Eystein or something like that, which we would expect after monophthongization. But since the E is from I umlaut of A, and the Y in this name, Eystein, at the very bottom, you can see it in standardized Old Norse, is from I umlaut of U, since, again, Younger Futhark runic writing ignores I umlaut, they will be written as AU. So EY written as AU in Younger Futhark. Of course, also you can see the very last word in line 1, Svein, again, EI is written as AI in Younger Futhark. This inscription, unlike the last one we looked at, still preserves the difference between E from Germanic and E from I umlaut because letu, the first word of line 2, is written with is, as we'd expect because that E is old. Notice, though, the third and fourth word in line 2, steina thassa, these stones, there's no word division between stones and these, steina and thessa. Same thing, the very last two words, haug, thena, this mound, this burial mound. So perhaps this particular writer is associating the demonstrative, this being used with the noun as actually being sort of an ending on the noun. It's also interesting the very first and second words in line 3, Eystein father, Eystein being the name of the dad and then the word father, are written together as if this is one word. So an interesting peek into the psychology of a culture that, of course, is mostly illiterate and doesn't have conventions about where words are divided. People could make their own decisions that do have some logical motivation despite being unconventional from our perspective. We also see, again, the E from I umlaut of A is written A. That is, for instance, the case in line 3, the last word, thassa, which should be thessa, and also in, and in the case of Okaudata, the word gorthu, which means they made, being written with A because that Okaudata is produced by U umlaut from the vowel A, the sound A as well. Well, whatever the roots of your interest in runes, whether you want to read Viking Age inscriptions with more of an informed background, or if you want to try writing Old Norse in runes yourself, I hope this video has provided some of the critical information that I find is often lacking in the other accounts that are available online. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.